Hey guys, it's Cromdar, bringing you another Mythic Plus commentary run. This time we're clearing Spires of Ascension 13. This was done on Tyrannical, Bolstering and Storming. Overall, the dungeon is relatively easy, with competent DPS that interrupt important spellcasts. As usual, I'll be going through all the tips and tactics that our entire group has come up with after several runs in this dungeon. My group consisted of a Vengeance Demon Hunter, a Balance Druid, a Marksman Hunter, and a Fire Mage. The first pull is relatively easy. An important mention here is the Forsworn Mender. He will apply a buff to himself which needs to be dispelled immediately, and I will show you why in a second. He also has a heal, which he applies to a random mob, which can either be interrupted or dispelled. In a moment, I will dispel the infused weapon, which will drop a physical model of a weapon on the ground, and my tank or any melee DPS will pick it up to do massive extra damage to anything they touch. Next pull is relatively easy in a coordinated group, but in an uncoordinated environment without assigned interrupts it can be a bit chaotic, because if the fist from the Goliath goes through, it can potentially one-shot the entire party depending on the key level. So our strategy here is to start out on the Goliath, deal some damage to him, and then pull the rest of the pack in. That way they all die around the same time. Another important mention here is the Forsworn Castigator. They will cast Burden of Knowledge, which, if uninterrupted, will deal massive single party damage. And you will see in a second that my Hunter gets the debuff application. He goes down to around 60% HP and gets a nasty magic debuff up on him. And as my Dispel is still on cooldown, my Druid also gets a debuff application. So potentially without kicks this can spiral out of control. The next pull is relatively easy. Again, there's the Forsworn Mender, which will cast Infused Weapon. I do my best job to dispel it immediately off of him, which will cause a weapon to drop on the ground, and then my melee DPS can pick it up to clear the pack faster. Otherwise, this pack also has a Castigator, which casts Burden of Knowledge, so be prepared to dispel that immediately as it is applied. It is important to mention here that this was done on a Tyrannical week. On fortified weeks, these mobs will be doing much more damage and will be much more problematic in total. Next pull is perhaps one of the more difficult ones in the whole dungeon. For fortified weeks, we've actually considered crowd controlling some of the mobs here, as you also spawn a Prideful immediately after this pull. This pack is a recap of everything we've seen up to this point. There's a Goliath who has the Fist, which needs to be interrupted by either the tank or anybody really, but 2 interrupts are needed for that. The Mender, which casts Infused Weapon, which can be dropped on the ground if dispelled. And the Castigators, which apply Burden of Knowledge. So overall, there really is a lot of damage going out to the entire party throughout this pull. And if the pull isn't done properly and only one target is killed, then you're in danger of spawning Prideful in the middle of the pack. So here I felt relatively safe and I decided to use Boon for a bit of extra damage so I can clear the pack more easily, especially since this was still bolstering. I make sure to remind my team to interrupt Burden of Knowledge. As you can see there, I'm already starting to fall behind on the healing a bit. We rotate through silences, through the Druids interrupt, and eventually we get the Goliath down too, as the Prideful is spawning. Overall, this Prideful is relatively easy. This week was still without Grievous, and it really wasn't an issue. And we really want to keep the Pridefuls for the bosses. As we started doing higher keys, we started noticing that Prideful cannot be killed without at least one party member using their cooldowns, so that's also something important to keep in mind. On lower keys such as 10s, 11s or 12s, you can kill the Prideful relatively easy without using cooldowns. On higher keys such as 14s and 15s, you definitely need to start using cooldowns to kill the Prideful itself. As you can see here, otherwise the party members will go too far down with the stacks. As this was recorded on a Tyrannical week, the bosses are the issue. But this boss is relatively easy compared to the second one. We really had no trouble with Prideful, Bloodlust, Power Infusion on the Druid. As long as the tank is kept up at around 100% for the frontal of the boss and everybody stays out of the black circles that come out of the bird, it's really not a problematic boss for us. An important thing to notice is that the overhead slash comes out when Kintara has 100% energy, so if you're targeting her and you see her energy, that's when you know to top off the tank so he doesn't die to the slash. Naturally, as a disc priest, or any healer actually, as I found out other healers also watch these videos, you should be helping out with the DPS here, especially in tyrannical weeks. The faster you get the bosses down, the easier it'll be to heal. My motto is, the faster the boss goes down, the less healing it requires. So it becomes easier for us to do our jobs if we also do DPS. That's, I think, partially why I started playing Disc Priest, because it had this fantasy of being the healer who's offensive, who helps out the party by DPSing and healing at the same time. Unfortunately, the fantasy struggles with certain affixes in this game, in this expansion for Shadowlands, and I'll get to that in the future videos. But for now, for Tyrannical Weeks, it has been working out relatively well, save for a few bosses here and there. For this dungeon, the most difficult boss, in my opinion, is the second boss by far. With enough DPS, she is doable. If DPS is missing, she becomes very, very problematic to heal for Disc Priests. For the upcoming pack, we grab all the stealth lines in this room. Sometimes that can be problematic, as oftentimes they can pounce on people, they apply a nasty bleed to the tank, and I know my tank can potentially dip really hard here. We communicate if he needs to kite. I use pain suppression on him here because he's tanking about 6 or 7 of them at the same time, and here we just start kiting. Vengeance Demon Hunters in general are able to do a lot of their DPS at range thanks to their Kyrian Covenant ability. And so this is what we end up doing here. As these guys get bolstered, their bleed starts doing increased damage too. So these really need to be kited. If the tank is face tanking these, you want to start using some defensives on this pack. For Prideful, we pull the Dark Praetor next. Very easy mob, he doesn't do much by himself. But unfortunately for our route, this is what we need to do. Otherwise we don't get Prideful for the last boss. So this is the route we take. He jumps away sometimes. If he's in the group with other enemies, I like to push him back with my knockback into the other group. And overall, just really easy. There's nothing needs to be done there. Surprisingly, the next pack we pull ends up being very, very problematic. These enemies launch randomly targeted spears at enemies. On tyrannical weeks, this is reasonable to heal. On fortified weeks, such as the next one with Grievous, they start hitting people for about 50% of their HP, applying Grievous, and overall, these three guys just become a very, very big problem. We may need to consider not pulling these in the future, because these are highly problematic, and especially because DPS likes to neglect them. They appear as three similarly named mobs who don't do anything, but this is definitely a healer pull. Another problem with this pack is that you need to save cooldowns for the next one, because the next one is 3 also relatively problematic mobs, and immediately after that they will spawn Prideful. So most of the pulls that go into Prideful I've marked as 4 or 5 in difficulty, because they can be quite problematic depending on the affixes. Here in the opener I use Dome. There's the Forsworn Champion, who also has infused weapons similar to the Mender at the start, which I dispel, announce to my party in Discord to pick up, and then they go ahead and pick it up. The Forsworn Squad Leader actually reduces the AoE damage taken of the party by 75%. We've learned this quite some time ago, but if people aren't aware of this and they'll be doing AoE while the Squad Leader is up, it is going to be problematic because they're doing 75% less damage. So you need to make sure that your party knows not to AoE and just single target the squad leader. Halfway through the pull, we spawn Prideful, relatively problematic one, but luckily I have cooldowns for this, so it's not an issue on this key level. On higher key levels, you definitely want to keep Boon of the Ascended for each Prideful. That really helps with the healing. At around 10 stacks, if the mob is not dead yet, you can definitely pop Boon of the Ascended, Radiance, and then just go with the normal DPS rotation for the Boon, and the whole party will be topped off relatively easily. The next pack is relatively easy. We do have interrupts assigned, so the mobs don't get to cast that much. In an unorganized group, if their casts go off, you need to be prepared to dispel the tank and potentially even let DPS who got too many debuffs on themselves die if you don't have a dispel available. Luckily we still have Prideful running, so it falls relatively easily. Now this pack also has a squad leader, so keep in mind that the pack takes 75% less AoE damage. There is random magic damage going out in form of debuffs, and there's 2 of them going out at the same time, so you can only dispel one, so be sure to top off the other. If you're lucky, you have Prideful for this, and it's relatively easy to heal, but as you can see, my party starts dipping quite quickly because we don't kill the squad leader in time. Again, in the future, we could really consider using CC on this pack, as we will be using CC in the future for the pack right before the second boss, as that is also a very big issue. If the debuff goes on the tank and the DPS, I generally tend to dispel the DPS because the tank is just so much better equipped to deal with damage than the DPS. And here, unfortunately, my mage ends up going down to the debuff applied. Throughout the dungeon, as you're about to see, there are around 2 or 3 spears, depending on where you go, here marked with the X, and only Kyrians can pick these up, and these spears will be very useful in clearing some of the packs in the future. The next pull is relatively easy again, it's just 3 Steel Claws who pounce if they attack first from stealth. They can do a bit of tank damage, and the tank can just kite them out or just take the damage too. It's only 3 of them, it's really not that big of an issue. It's very important to keep in mind that tank kiting is much more necessary this expansion in my opinion. I think that a lot of packs are relatively complex in the spells that they're casting and the damage patterns, so on hierarchies it's definitely okay to ask the tank to start kiting a bit more in order to survive better. Now this pack is relatively problematic as there are around 4 or 5 Steel Claws in addition to Praetor. Again, the Steel Claws apply a very nasty bleed to the tank, and it is actually relatively difficult to kite here because following these stairs there's patrol. This week was also fortified, so the Steel Claws deal absolutely massive damage. And following this pack there's a Prideful, so if you don't have the party topped off and the bleed is on the tank as you'll see here, it can get a bit chaotic on higher key levels. Unfortunately for this key level, we're quite well geared, so it's not a problem. We line up in a diagonal and we're just immune to the Prideful swirlies, as we call them, and we get the Prideful down. I don't think I even need to boon here, but I might. An important mention goes to mind control. With mind control, you can control a humanoid in the middle of the pack, and the rest of the pack will aggro to that humanoid and kill him. As we've tested in the future, we found out that if you mind control the humanoid before tagging him, he will not give percent. So unfortunately, mind controlling for now in this dungeon seems a bit unviable, depending on the affix, and I guess more testing needs to be done in the future to see if Priest can make it work somehow. With the patrol positioning here, we unfortunately have to wait a bit with Prideful. Since this was fortified and bolstering, we pull the Ether Divers back. It's just 3 of them, a really easy pull overall. They don't do anything if they're silenced. They do apply stacking debuff if the party lets the cast go through, but overall it's not that big of an issue. We actually skip the Goliath because he takes a bit of time, and we go straight to the squad leader pack and bring that down with Prideful. Again, the squad leader must be single targeted. He reduces the AoE damage taken off the party by 75%. The Forsworn champion also costs infused weapon, which needs to be dispelled by you or any class that can purge. That will cause the weapon to drop on the ground, and then melee can walk over it, no need to click anything, and just deal a bit of extra damage with their auto attacks. After the squad leader goes down, there's some magic debuffs that go out, but overall the rest of the pack is relatively easy with AoE. I've noticed many dungeons in Shadowlands so far apply debuffs, magical debuffs to 2 random party members, so in my opinion it would be really cool to try to run some dungeons with a warlock whose imp can also dispel magic, and I think that may actually simplify a lot of pulls a lot, especially on fortified. This Goliath is really easy, he's there alone. We do not have a better pathing for this. Maybe if we're a bit riskier, we could pull the other divers before with the Goliath, but for now we just decided to take it easy, go with a safe route, and clear the Goliath alone. The next pull in the whole dungeon is probably the most difficult one. If no crowd control is applied here, this will be very, very difficult. So here I was trying out my first mind control, but in fact, if you walk out of range with mind control, it stops automatically. As a result, the entire pack goes onto me, and luckily I actually managed to fear them here. At the same time, there's a squad leader, which my party nukes, as you can see there. I was lucky with the fear, they went away from the squad leader, I could then knock the whole pack back, and we actually killed the squad leader without bolstering the rest of the pack. We got really lucky there, and my demon hunter caught the rest of the party with the fear too. So overall, this is really solid group coordination. The rest of the pack still remains relatively difficult even after the squad leader is dead, but more manageable with AoE. At least they start dying. There is massive damage going out on the tank because of the Steel Claw applying the bleeds. There is massive random damage going out from the Dark Praetor. There's the champion who had cast Infused Weapon, but I've dispelled and then was picked up. And overall, a really problematic pack, if not managed properly. Also spawns Prideful immediately after, so if you're out of cooldowns on the hierarchy, very, very rough overall. At least it spawns Prideful when the entire pack dies and not in the middle. Luckily for this Prideful, I've also kept a boon just in case. Unfortunately, I did use Power Infusion at the start, which was a mistake on my part, as the second boss is coming up. And for the second boss, our plan is to have full cooldowns and burst her down as quickly as possible with Prideful. And we succeed in the future. You really, really want to keep Power Infusion for the second boss. And on Fortified, you want to keep Power Infusion for this pack here. Now, this boss, for me, is divided into two parts. The first part is she jumps on two random party members and applies a really nasty bleed to them. Personally, I like to Kyrian it off immediately if she jumps on me, so I can just keep DPSing and not worry about my own health. There, my druid has gotten a debuff, and you can see he's losing about 10% HP around every second. For now, Atonement Healing is enough for him, but later on, when it gets chaotic and there's lots of swirlies going out, it becomes much more difficult. There, the second jump wasn't me, and I Kyrian Potion it immediately, so I don't have to worry about my own health. As you can see with our DPS, we luckily bring her down relatively quickly. We save all the DPS, as during the second phase, when she's recharging, it becomes practically impossible to stand still. In these moments, I like to Rapture. I know some of my party members occasionally take damage from this. Rapture allows me to cast on the move, so actually I take some swirlies there too, and luckily I was shielded, but this deals absolutely massive damage on Tyrannical. Full DPS needs to go into this. A cool little competition we have too is jumping on the angel as she's flying from the bushes. You don't actually need to go to the end of the platform to click on her. You can click on her as she's flying, and some of us manage to do it, some of us don't. It doesn't really save any time, but it's just a cool little thing we like to compete on. And after this, the dungeon becomes relatively straightforward. There is also the problem of the 3 last adds right before the last boss. We have our own strategy for it, and I'll go through that too. But overall, the third boss and the last boss are relatively unproblematic, especially for Disc Priest, and I'll show you why. As you can see on the right there's another Kyrian Spear which we pick up, which will be really needed in the future. So my hunter misdirects this mob to my tank, and alone this Hellion doesn't really do much. She does do some pulsing AoE on Fortified, which in my opinion can be topped off with Atonement Healing. She also does a frontal, which the tank needs to walk out of, which also sends 4 shockwaves going in different directions, so if melee is not careful, they can actually get one shot by that. For this next pack, I like to Mindsoothe the Hellion just in case, because we skip this pack. It's a problematic one, so we never clear this. You can actually just go around the columns here and jump down. I'm pretty sure Mindsoothe is not needed if you're really careful, but Mindsoothe just provides a bit of extra leeway. For this pack we usually have a rogue, so we shroud, but here you can actually skip this all with Mindsoothe too, so you're kind of replacing the rogue here, As you can see, you can jump on this on the little fence, and with Mind Sooth you don't pull them. If you do pull them, they can be relatively problematic. Just make sure not to touch the Goliath, because the Goliath will just be casting his Fist Slam, and if you outrange it, you will never get hit by it. He'll just keep doing it over and over. This pull is surprisingly relatively difficult for being non-elites, because these bolster and hurl random spears into party members. So I actually just use my Dome here in case as a precaution, so that we avoid getting one shot. Third boss in difficulty is similar to the first boss. There is some single target healing that needs to be done, and you want to save most of your cooldowns for the intermission. So for example, my druid will need some priority healing here with a blast. Melee has to spread out from the tank, because the charged stomp will apply a nasty debuff to them, but luckily you can mass dispel that, so that's not an issue. We like to stack up the orbs in a line, as you can see there. We will be stacking up our 2 sets of orbs in the same line, so then we can soak them very easily. Overall, during downtime, there's really not a lot to heal. I would save all my defensives for the intermission if you don't have Turtle or Cloak. And actually there, my Hunter uses Turtle, so that makes this boss a bit more problematic, because usually you want to keep immunities for the orbs, as you will see later. But luckily my tank can just soak most of them in meta plus Pain Suppression. Even on Tyrannical, that is more than enough. I actually don't think Feign Deathing is a good solution here, because he needs to spend his energy, and if he doesn't get the casts off, he won't spend his energy. So here, because we lined up the orbs properly, my tank can just stay in place, soak the orbs with the meta, and when the stacks get too high, he actually gets launched up in the air by the storming there too, so one of the orbs actually reaches the boss and does some AoE damage, but luckily it's not a problem. He's on 9 stacks now, but I pop Pain Suppression on him. Even with that, he requires a bit of healing, but nothing too special, really. We had good coordination of cooldowns there, so Disc Priest is really good for this fight overall, in my opinion. Once we're done with round rotation of the orbs, we start with the same tactic from the other side. So here, as you can see, we start stacking them in one spot and moving towards the central fountain. Again, the fight repeats. Usually we're unable to reach the second intermission, but that can also happen in the future. It is very important to mention that during the intermission, when he's down and he's recharging his energy, he takes around 100% bonus damage, if I'm not mistaken. So that's where you want to use your API, on your highest cooldown class. So in our case, this is the Druid, because he can make the full use of the API. Stacking the orbs again, doing some dedicated Shadowman healing to the targets with a blast. Dispelling Charge Stomp, very important from the tank, it does a lot of damage. And the fight just keeps going like this until we bring down the boss. Overall, pretty easy in a coordinated group. If orbs go all over the place and the entire party soaks them, or nobody soaks them, then that becomes a problem, but that's a tactics issue. Numbers-wise, on the Tyrannical, I don't feel like I've struggled with this boss. It is very, very predictable damage, and that's where Disc Priests are quite good. So I managed to put some DPS into the boss too. And there the boss goes down. We grabbed the last pack of non-elites here. Again, these bolster, they apply Grievous, they spawn Spiteful. They are surprisingly complicated for being non-elites, but we managed to pull through them with some AoE damage. The randomly targeted abilities they do go at random party members, and on higher difficulties they will bring people down to 50% of their HP, so you really want to use some mass stuns. Priest Fear actually works too. If you can see that all of them are casting their spell at the same time, you can go ahead and fear some or even all of them, and that pack becomes relatively easy after that. Now on Fortified, the 3 mobs you're about to see is probably the last boss of the Shadowlands expansion. They are very, very problematic if not managed properly. But this is Tyrannical. Luckily we don't have too many issues with this, and following these 3 ads, the last boss is also relatively easy as long as tactics are done properly and people contribute. We personally like to pull either the middle mob or the leftmost mob first. The middle one doesn't do anything except for apply and damage taken increase and do a frontal on the tank. The tank can just walk out of it and there's practically no damage happening on the middle mob, so you can just fully DPS. The second mob becomes a bit problematic, especially if you have graphics settings turned down, because if you have graphics settings turned down, you will not be able to see the shockwaves, which take out around 90% of your HP. As you can see in a bit, she will cast random spears at us. So now, for example, this spear went onto the rogue, I think, and now it's in the ground next to the dead angel. And in a second, that spear will start pulsing massive shockwaves. And there we go, they go in 4 different directions. If you get hit by that, that is 80 to 90% of your HP. And with lower graphic settings, you do not see where they go. You do not see them at all. So here I find it is very easy to try to find a dead spot for where the shockwaves go. So for example, now I cannot be hit by default with these shockwaves, and I just stand there. So I advise, if you're a DPS, tank, or a healer, definitely do the same. Try to find a safe spot in this fight. And now for Fortified Weeks, this is the last boss of the dungeon. This mob here can destroy the party. Occasionally we bloodlust this guy. And here, as you can see, we use the Kyrian Spears, which we've picked up earlier. We coordinate with the tank so that the guy is permanently under the Kyrian Spear. He doesn't get to play the game. There is pulsing AoE going out here. Again, it's buffed by Fortified. If there is Grievous, people start bleeding too. There is Spears going out here because the mob absorbs abilities from the previous angels. And overall, it just starts becoming a mess if you don't use Spears and if you don't Bloodlust or use cooldowns. Even on Tyrannical, this boss is difficult. On Fortified, it is an absolute nightmare. And of course, after it, we have Prideful. So if you don't have cooldowns for Prideful and Hierarchies, you're in big trouble. And if your group is behind on healing. And again, for Tyrannical, we like to keep Prideful for the last boss. It could actually be a smart idea to perhaps on Fortified Weeks to proc Prideful for the last stat we just killed, and I think we may adjust to that in the next week. But here we just line up on the diagonal, do the usual strategy, atonement healing for the whole party on Prideful. Try to save cooldowns because this is the last boss, and if she's taking her time to die, then it becomes a problem. We, I believe in this pool, we stagger our Time Warp. I know a lot of people like to combine Prideful and Time Warp, but on some bosses, such as this one, with segments, with intermissions, and for example, the last boss of Plaguefall, stacking Prideful and Time Warp is actually a very big issue for a healer. Because the intermissions start a new phase, and the new phase without DPS cooldowns becomes longer. So here, because we're taking our time on killing her and it's Tyrannical, she applies 2 debuffs to the party. Again, a Warlock could be really useful here, but I just go ahead and mass dispel it. I'm pretty confident I'll have it for the end of the intermission. Avoid Abyssal Blasts, which one-shot our mage there because he wasn't careful, he didn't see it. But luckily I have Combatress, so. And now the intermission begins. Here I like to call out how many orbs go to each side, and we kind of occupy the side. And here, for example, 4 orbs went right, and we coordinate with our party and move out, grab them all in. After that, I ask my party to stack. I try to stay around the middle at first, maybe dispel 1 or 2 stacks. And while the person in charge of the spear aims it, once the intermission is done, and only then do I mass dispel, because sometimes there are surprise, last minute, last second ticks, and I like to be sure that we are completely free of ticks for the beginning of the second phase. And as you can see here, we Time Warp, put some damage into her, just to get through this phase as quickly as possible. If it lasts for a long time, then it gets a bit nasty with debuffs. Not the worst boss. Even if the intermissions are long, it's really not difficult. There, for example, I don't have a second dispel for my mage, so I pay some brain suppression him in order to put a bit more damage into the boss. For the last phase, I actually have PI again, and we have cooldowns again, so the last phase isn't an issue. Which is why time warping on the second phase is actually much better, especially on Tyrannical Weeks. I would really recommend it. That is by far what made this boss easier. And here we see our second intermission. You can still deal some damage to her as she's charging. Try to spread the group around as the orbs go out. It's important to mention that on Grievous Weeks, she does do a bit of damage when she goes away, so the whole party will go into Grievous, and that can be relatively problematic to heal. There's also magic debuffs going out, which proc Grievous. Again, we go through intermission. I mass dispel the magic debuffs off the whole party. Priest is very, very nice for this fight. Other healers have to do a bit of healing. I can just mass dispel atonement and start damaging the boss. And there's some wings in the way of the camera going on there. That's always really frustrating for our party. We always like to complain about how the wings occupy the whole screen. Again, 2 magic debuffs going out, 1 on me, 1 on the tank. I prioritize myself, but in this case the boss is already dead and we managed to get the 2 chests. Thanks for tuning in to my Spires of Ascension commentary run. Hope you've enjoyed it, hope you've taken something away from yourself, hope you give it a try. It's definitely a really cool dungeon, we've practiced a lot, we have a lot of fun with it. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.